Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Tuesday. Just checking to see who's here. Is Maddie here yet? Maddie, are you here?
Yes.
Did you want to make an announcement?
Yeah, for sure. I just wanted to let everybody know that, so sorry, I had to take down my hair because I look really messy right now. So first of all, I just wanted to let everybody know that we have our first student government meeting today. Student government's a really great way to get involved on campus. You get really great transcript notation that makes your application really stand out if you guys are going to a different university or college after West Valley, and you get priority registration. So it's really great to be a senator. If you guys have any questions, you guys can email me. You guys can do that on campus, or if you have my regular email, you guys are welcome to email me to figure out how you guys can do that. Our first meeting is going to be today at 3:45. And also, student government, as well as a lot of other programs, are really trying to encourage students to put their pronouns on Canvas as well as on Zoom. So how you do it on Canvas, Dr. Kelly actually was really great and put it in our modules tab. So there's instructions on how to do that. But on Zoom, all you have to do is just click the rename button. And then if you see my screen, I just put parentheses and put my pronouns like she, her, he, him, they, them, whatever you guys feel comfortable with using. You guys don't have to, but we just want to strongly encourage it to make West Valley a really cool and inclusive place for everybody. So yeah, I think that's it. Thanks. Sorry.
Thank you, Maddie. That's great. So Maddie is your student government president. I don't know how many of you actually knew that. And the Student Government Association is a fantastic group. They do a lot of good work. Even though we're in COVID, that doesn't mean that they don't still have responsibilities, and they're always looking for student volunteers. Plus, it looks damn good on a resume, guys, if you're trying to look for campus activities, and when the campus is closed, it's not so easy. Student government is a great way that you can do that. Of course, if you're willing to get involved, don't just sign up so you can put it on your resume. Actually get involved and do some good work for the campus. So Maddie, thank you for all the good work that you do, and the student senators, they're fantastic as well. I used to be an advisor to the group, so I know just how great this group is. All right, today we are focusing on a new country, Great Britain, one of my favorite countries. I actually studied in Great Britain for 9 months. I was awarded a Rotary Scholarship that allowed me to get a master's degree while I was there. But the deal of the scholarship was you have to actually speak at Rotary clubs. So I was traveling throughout England. I had a great opportunity to meet Rotarians, both in Southern and Northern England, while at the same time also getting a master's degree and having a little money that I could travel around. So the Brits are wonderful people. They love to tease Americans. They're very superior, but they also have great affection for the United States because they know that we saved their ass twice. So let's go ahead and move on. Britain has many firsts under its belt. It was, for instance, the first nation to industrialize. It was the first nation to effectively develop a parliamentary democracy. And because of its economic, military, and colonial dominance in the world, it had an international influence on the development of other political systems. Many comparative government texts will actually put Great Britain first as the first chapter. Right after the introduction, it's the first country that you look at. And I think I mentioned to you before, I used to start with Great Britain as my touchstone, but I found that actually makes more sense to start with the United States because, as I explained to you, you guys are most familiar with the American political system. And so it makes sense that we would compare and contrast to that particular system. But it would also make total sense if you wanted to start with Great Britain because of its many firsts. Britain has no written constitution. That doesn't mean that it has no constitution, right? It has no written constitution. That is, there is no single document like we have, or like Germany has with this basic law that says, here are the rules and structure of government. Great Britain doesn't have that. But the Brits would tell you that they absolutely have a constitution. It's just spread out in many different ways, and I'll explain what I mean by that in today's lecture. But the fact that it has no written constitution is kind of irrelevant because its competitive party elections its parliamentary representation, and its cabinet government still make it an ideal model of a traditional democracy for us to study. We've taken a look at congressional systems. That's what the United States is. And there are a lot of congressional systems around the world. And although I've never done an actual count, my guess is that there are probably more parliamentary systems around the world than there are congressional systems. So studying Great Britain's parliament is obviously very important if you want to understand how to make comparisons to other parliamentary systems around the world. But I want to zero in here on one word that I just mentioned, and that is tradition, right? The traditional democracy, because the Brits maintain tradition with a fanaticism. And the best way I think that I can illustrate that to you is with the following clip, which shows the opening of Parliament. And the opening of Parliament has been this way for centuries. And I don't mean like for just 2 centuries like what we've had here in the United States. I mean for multiple centuries. You could go back to the 1600s, for instance, and find that Parliament is opened the exact same way. Well, without motor cars, of course, but the traditions are what's important. Let's take a look. So just to give you some context, there are 2 chambers. You have a House of Lords and you have a House of Commons. This is the House of Lords. The House of Commons will be invited into the House of Lords, but they don't actually take seats. They have to stand in the back. Only the House of Lords sit down, and of course, the Queen.
My lords, pray be seated.
Close the door.
See that hole on the floor? They have been pounding there for hundreds of years.
Open the door.
And then the Queen's representative invites the House of Commons and takes the scepter of state, which represents who rules. And it's the House of Commons that actually rules. The Queen will then read a speech, but it's not a speech that she wrote. It is written by the Prime Minister. She reads whatever it is that he gives her.
My lords and members of the House of Commons.
The speech is longer than that, obviously, but she's now done with the speech. Ceremony comes to an end. House of Commons returns to its chamber, along with the scepter of state. Democracy is assured. Margaret Thatcher. And everybody celebrates another opening of Parliament. So lots of tradition, steeped in tradition. In fact, in some ways, it's kind of stifling. Britain didn't become a democracy overnight. It evolved gradually and slowly into the system that it has today. This evolution has, in fact, provided stability to the political system, but at the same time, it has also made the system more rigid and therefore difficult in its capabilities to respond to the more modern needs of a populace. This ceremony that you just saw, it's a great relic from the 1600s, but is it really something that can be used for the modern needs of society? Well, the Brits would say yes, absolutely. That because we follow our traditions doesn't mean that we can't continue to meet what those needs are. But not everyone in Britain would agree with that, which is why there are always calls for reform, not necessarily to throw out that tradition, not to overthrow the Queen and cut off her head, but rather to make a parliament, for instance, that perhaps is more representative, that is better prepared to respond to the changing needs, the economic conditions, the geopolitical conditions of Great Britain. Well, by and large, those reforms, which have been offered, honestly, since the 1990s when Tony Blair was in office, really didn't go very far because, again, of this fanaticism for tradition. And then in mid-2016, the Brits went and did something that is, to say the least, very un-British. They surprised the world by voting to leave the European Union. Brexit. Now, we are still speculating as to what economic consequences Brexit will have. And indeed, if you follow international news at all, there have been lots of articles recently about what's going on in Great Britain with Boris Johnson. He made a deal with the European Union as to how to pull Great Britain out and still establish a trade deal. He's decided he doesn't like that deal. And now he is currently pushing through Parliament a new deal. Well, I shouldn't call it a deal because it's not something that the European Union has agreed to at all. Instead, it is a list of demands which Boris Johnson's government is saying, this is how we are going to exit. If you don't like it, we don't care. Well, that could have some serious consequences on trade, because if the European Union simply says, fine, you're no longer going to have access to our markets, that is going to have an economic impact on Great Britain. And nobody knows what the consequences to that will be. There's been speculation, of course, but no one really knows what's going to happen. So we're still speculating as to what the consequences would be. What we do know is that politically on the domestic front, Brexit has sparked turmoil. So in short, Britain is a fascinating country to study. As I said, it's one of my favorites. So, as with the United States, let us begin with our first category, making of the modern state. And we will just go through the country, again, a deep bore, going category by category. So let's clear up some confusion about the name. Great Britain. Right? Here in America, we tend to call the island England, the English. But in fact, England is not the proper name. England, in fact, is one nation within a larger political entity. Great Britain includes England, Wales, and Scotland. These are three nations. Now, remember, I defined the term nation for you in our first lecture. And when we're talking about nation, you have to have some kind of collective identity. This is really important. A basis in which people see each other as English, as Scots, as Irish, or even as Americans. It doesn't have to be ethnic, right? We have a political identity here, a political collective identity that can bring diverse people together. If you are the descendants of English colonists, as I am, if you are the descendants of African slaves, if you are a Chinese immigrant like my wife, there is a collective identity that is based on a political identification here in the United States, not ethnic, not racial, but political, cultural. In Great Britain, increasingly you are finding, let me put it this way, the English are English because of their English ethnic heritage. You would not call, for instance, someone who is the children of Indian immigrants living in London English, but you could call them British right? And I'll make the distinction here in just a minute. You wouldn't call an African immigrant from Kenya living in Scotland Scot, even though he may be a citizen of the nation of Scotland. He would not be considered Scottish any more than I would be considered Japanese, right? There is an ethnic identity. So Scot, Welsh, English, Irish, we are talking about different national identities, different nations here. And I'll talk about Ireland in just a minute. So England, Wales, and Scotland, they are considered Great Britain. They are all part of the same island. If we include Northern Ireland, then we are actually talking about the United Kingdom, the UK. That's the shortened, abbreviated name. Now, as with your textbook, I'm actually going to use these terms interchangeably, Great Britain and the United Kingdom. But it's only called, technically, the United Kingdom when you include Northern Ireland, which you can see on your PowerPoint slide here. Northern Ireland is that orange block that is part of the island of Ireland. Northern Ireland is not part of the Republic of Ireland. It is, in fact, part of the United Kingdom, a separate political entity from Ireland. Now, you have 66.65 million people. If your PowerPoint, if you happen to print out the PowerPoint and your number says different, don't worry, I just updated it. Though interestingly, when I updated this last year, I have here written in my notes 67 million, but I just checked on Google before our lecture and 66. I don't think that 1 million people have died in Great Britain over the last year. So let's just assume that it is somewhere in between 66 and 67 million for the 2019 estimate. But we do know that the island of England hasn't gotten any larger or smaller, 94,000 square miles. And not surprisingly, in a country where open space is premium, though amazingly, there is a lot of open space in England. If you get on a train and you travel into central and northern England, you will find an amazing amount of open space. Nearly 81.5% of the population is urban. That is, 81.5% live in a city or town. Now, its isolation as an island has shaped the national culture of the British, who perceive themselves as both a part of, but also apart from the continent of Europe. The Brits don't really like to be called Europeans. Right? They're not Europeans. They're Brits, or they're English, or they're Scots. You don't call them UKers, all right? They are British. But they obviously see a very important role in that Great Britain has on the European continent and has had for centuries. And let's not forget that, of course, the English throne today is the descendants of the Normans, who were French, all right? Don't tell the English that, they don't like the French. But in any event, what you have is an ethnic culture that really is a conglomerate. When we're talking about Anglo-Saxons, we are talking about Normans, we're talking about Norwegians, we're talking about a conglomerate of different ethnic groups that had been on the European continent and then conquered Great Britain about 1,000 years ago. But intermingled with the Celtic population that was there, creating what we have today, an English population, at least in the southern portion. And there is a very strong ethnic identity still within Scotland and within Wales, largely because Scotland was not conquered by the English until much later after the Normans had conquered England. And even once the English did conquer the Scots, you don't see a lot of interracial mingling, right? The Scots maintained their culture. They're very proud. They still speak the language. Same with the Welsh as well. They have their own language that they speak. But when it comes to, are we part of Europe? Well, yes, we are part of Europe, but we're also very proud that we are not a part of Europe. This is why back in 1994, when the Channel was being created, right? That's why I have this train up here. You might be wondering what's going on with the train picture here, Dr. Kelly. 1994, when the Channel was being built, and it was open. It was actually being built when I was living there, 91, 92. not all Brits were happy about this, because now you had a tether to the European continent. Britain is an island, and it was very proud of that isolation. It was very proud to be apart from Europe. But now it was connected. And it was kind of hilarious because you actually had some of the older people saying, oh my God, you watch, we're going to have rabies in this island now because of this channel. And in fact, Great Britain has a very strict containment policy. If ever you bring a pet over, for instance, you've got to keep that pet in quarantine for several weeks. All right, critical junctures. What were the critical junctures in Britain's slow but steady march to democracy? Well, we could go back as far as 1215, when feudal barons in the Magna Carta demanded restrictions on royal powers in dealing with their collective group, which would later become known as Parliament. This was largely because King John, right, the son of one of the Henrys, Henry II or Henry III. King John was really a horrible ruler. I don't know if he was the worst, but he was one of the worst rulers, incredibly corrupt, had absolutely no care for the people or for his barons. Now, most royal officials really had no care for the people. But if you piss off your barons, then you're in trouble, because it's the barons who actually keep you in power. It's the barons who support you with the troops when you go to war. It's the barons who support you with the funds in order to operate your government. And King John always wanted more and more and more. And so finally, the barons get together and they say, if you don't sign this list of agreements, which recognizes what our rights are, we're going to overthrow you. And John was smart enough to know that self-preservation required him to sign the Magna Carta. Now, I don't want to get into a long history lesson here, because historians will tell you that it didn't really matter so much in 1215. It actually took several centuries for the Magna Carta to really take root, because other leaders, like for instance Richard II, would simply ignore it. All right. So if you were a very strong king, you could ignore the Magna Carta. If you were a weak king, then, like say Richard I, then you, or no, not Richard I. Say like, well, I can't think of anything right now, but if you were a weak king, then the barons could point to the Magna Carta and say, you need to follow these rules. Still, the significance is that for the first time in Western civilization, you had a statement of rights that had been written down on paper, in which granted the elite saying to the elite, all right, this is not a popular democracy. The peasants have not risen up and say, we want rights, right? The barons don't care about the peasants. The barons care about themselves, but it is a start. It is a first step towards what eventually will lead to a more popular democracy. Perhaps we should then take a look at 1688, because in 1688, with the Glorious Revolution, Parliament firmly established its right to rule through the process of a constitutional democracy and parliamentary elections. The Glorious Revolution. Every once in a while, the Brits kind of go full bore and decide to cut off a king's head. It doesn't happen often. Right? It didn't happen to many. It happened to Charles I, because he didn't play by the rules that Parliament had established. But by and large, the kings and queens, although there were fewer, understood that they had to play a balancing role with Parliament. And so over time, and I really mean over time, because democracy does not come overnight in Great Britain. It takes centuries to develop. And it's this kind of tug of war that is going on between the crown and the Parliament. Every once in a while, you do have a peasant uprising, but it's always put down. One thing that the crown and the barons can always agree on is, we don't want the peasants to have any kind of political power here. It would take a long time before workers got the right to vote. It would take a long time before even women got the right to vote. Women got the right to vote here in the United States before British women did. So democracy doesn't suddenly flourish just because Parliament is reasserting itself, because Parliament doesn't represent, Parliament would say that it represents everybody, but not everybody has the right to vote for a member of Parliament. Only large landowners have the right to vote for a member of Parliament. So Parliament really represents the interest of the elite. But it's a conservative system. It's a patriarchal system. It's one in which the elite say, you know what, we have the best interests of society at heart, just as I know what I need to do for my daughter, right? My daughter doesn't maybe want to eat her vegetables, but I know that it's important for her. And so I make sure that she eats her vegetables. And when she becomes an adult, if she never wants to eat another vegetable and just eat cheeseburgers for the rest of her life, she will be able to do that. But as long as she's in my care, I'm going to make sure that she has a healthy diet. It's a very patriarchal kind of thinking. Now, put that on a macro level into a conservative society, a hierarchical society, a society in which there is a very strong belief that there is no equality. Right? That's what a true conservative would argue. People are not equal. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are faster than others. Some people have a greater knack at skills and abilities. Would you really want a peasant to rule a government? Of course not. They aren't educated enough. They don't know anything about government. Now, let's also keep in mind that this is an argument made by the elite to keep the elite in power. So that's what a true capital C conservative is. We don't really have that here in the United States. When we talk about, as I mentioned to you before, conservatives and liberals here in the United States, they're both liberals, right liberals and left liberals. But when we move to Europe, you will truly find real conservatives. You will truly find real socialists, not like these fake democratic socialists like Bernie Sanders, right? Real ideological differences, conservative, liberal, radical. And so it wasn't until the 20th century that Great Britain really moves into a more liberal type of government. It was a very conservative government, a patriarchal government. That doesn't mean that all the conservatives in Great Britain today have been eliminated. There are still plenty of conservatives in Great Britain who would argue that, you know, poor people really shouldn't be voting because what do they know? They're too easily swayed by bread and circuses. When I was in Great Britain, I was kind of amazed as I would go to these Rotary clubs. And I don't want to give the Brits a bad name because I actually love the Brits. I really do. But I was surprised by some of their comments and indeed a bit offended when I was explaining, well, I come from Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is a very multi-ethnic city. And I explained to them the LA riots of 1992. And one older gentleman said, well, you know, these black people, they're just animals as far as I'm concerned. That was pretty shocking. And that is something, a thought, that many older English still have today. That is a conservative idea. When we talk about racism, a belief in hierarchy, a belief in racial superiority, whites are superior to blacks, that is a conservative ideology, capital C. So you will still find that in Great Britain today, even if its political system represents more of a liberal idea, democracy, equality. But there's still a lot of conservative thought within Europe today. We see it, for instance, in places like Hungary, which is why I asked you to read that article last week. So it's not until the late 1800s that we actually see full male suffrage in Great Britain. The late 1800s, that's much later than the United States. Really, by the early 1800s, pretty much every male who wants to vote and is white can vote, whether you own property or not. But that's not the case in Great Britain. It's not until the late 1800s that we finally see the suffrage being extended to most males. Most, not even all, but most. Then all women are given the right to vote if they are over the age of 21 in 1928. Finally, the voting age for both men and women was lowered to 18 in 1969, which is just around the same time that the US is doing the same thing. I think ours is in 1968. So it is a slow march to democracy. Part of the struggle behind the cause for expanding voting rights was the Industrial Revolution, gaining steam in the late 18th century, when Britain's society dramatically transformed from a predominantly feudal peasant society, where the right of the vote was based on land holdings, to one where commercial interests and economic interests held important sway. Great Britain is the first country to industrialize, and as such is the first country to go through that kind of transformation from a predominantly peasant society, all right, a rural society. Everybody farmed or worked in some kind of small craft shop. There were no real manufacturing centers in Great Britain prior to, say, the 1700s. All right, if you made shoes, then maybe you made shoes in a guild with some other workers, but we would hardly call it a factory. Chances are you pretty much just made it yourself at home or in your own workshop where you hired an assistant. That was the society. Now, there is, of course, a process that this goes through. I don't want to give you a history of industrialization here. If you are actually interested in this, take me next semester when I teach Poli-Sci 3, because we will read Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto. And although Marx was wrong on so many things, how he explains the process of industrialization and the effects that it has on the peasants and the workers is pretty accurate. So we take a look at that in Poli-Sci 3. So I'm not going to go into it in great detail here. Let me just say that the Industrial Revolution brings about tremendous wrenching change. You have peasants that have been working on these lands for generations are suddenly now told to get off the land. Now, that's not because you had factories being built throughout the land. It's because there was one very important item, good, that fueled the Industrial Revolution, and that was textiles. And of course, textiles require one very important item, wool, which comes from sheep. And what do sheep eat? They eat grass, which means that all of this farmland that had been used by peasants to support themselves are now being fenced in something called the enclosure laws. This throws the peasants off the land so that this land can now be used for sheep grazing, so that the wool can be gathered and then made into textiles. So you have all these landless peasants, and they are now flooding into the cities, places like Birmingham, places like eventually Edinburgh, of course, places like London, where they are unemployed. But as the factories are being built, they are now being brought into the factories. But are these good high-paying jobs? Of course not. The reason why Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto is because he knew that there was an audience out there that was suffering, that was being exploited. If there wasn't an audience to read this book, the book never would have had the impact that it did. But there were people being exploited. Millions of people throughout Europe were being exploited by the Industrial Revolution. So this brings about tremendous change, social change, political change. The political change at first was these yeoman manufacturers who are now growing into great industrial capitalists did not own vast tracts of land like the lords of the past had, but they demanded political power and influence. And because the government recognized that the Industrial Revolution, the creation of textiles, was the way of the future for Great Britain, that these men, and they were all men, had to have more say in the government. So we see an expansion of political rights for at least, let's call them the middle class, because of the Industrial Revolution. But this starts to expand then further into the working population, because the Industrial Revolution, as I just said, creates horrific conditions. And you know, Marx, he didn't think that there was going to be a revolution in a place like Russia. In fact, the problem with Marx is that he was wrong on so many levels. Marx had predicted that a communist revolution would happen in an industrial society. There has never been a communist revolution in an industrial society. Every single communist revolution has been in a peasant society, just like Russia in 1917, just like China in 1949, just like Vietnam, just like Cuba. All of these countries have been peasant-based countries. Marx thought that the communist revolution would happen in a place like Germany. His buddy Engels thought that it would happen in a place like England, because that is where you had the anger, the bitterness, the horrific conditions that were driving these people into more radical ideologies. Well, the elite were not fools. They could see this. They could see that their actions could lead to consequences, and we better find some way to prevent that from happening. Otherwise, we will lose it all. And so partly out of fear of trade union demands that workers should control the means of production, Britain's political elites turned to an interventionist state in which the government would play a much larger economic and political role. Rather than the laissez-faire, keep government small, let business do what it wants policies of the past. By the early 20th century, the British government, as many European governments do, but we're talking about Britain, the British government comes to the conclusion that if we don't step in and try to ameliorate these horrific conditions that these workers are facing, then we're going to lose it all. There's going to be a revolution. We see the same argument happening here in the United States. The progressive era under Teddy Roosevelt, for instance, horrific conditions for American workers, terrible poverty in the cities. People are living on starvation wages. Living is a generous word. They are eking out on starvation wages. The Socialist Party, led by Eugene Debs, is gaining millions of votes in every presidential election. And so what Teddy Roosevelt says, essentially to the elite, to the robber barons, and Teddy Roosevelt was part of the elite. Let's not pretend that he was some populist, from the working class that moved his way up. No, he was born into a rich family. So he understood the ways and the thinking of the elite. And what he said to them was, not literally, but in terms of his policies, what he said to them was, if you don't give a little, you're going to lose it all when the revolution comes. You want to prevent a revolution? Then let's pass a food and drug law that actually protects consumers. You want to prevent a revolution? Then let's ensure that there's actually true, free, and fair competition here in our market economy, rather than the monopolies and trusts that are being formed. It was an argument that the elite didn't particularly like because they didn't want to give up anything, but eventually they came around to because they understood that if we don't give a little, we could lose it all. Well, this takes us now on to economic and social policy. Do you like that transition, right? Building up, starting with the political vote, and then we move seamlessly into the economy. So this decision to move to a more interventionist government was no more apparent than after the Great Depression of the 1930s and the terrible destruction and deprivation of World War II, which convinced both conservative and labor parties that the state had to take a more active role in managing the economy and providing for the social welfare of its citizens. Now, again, there are motivations here that go beyond, let's just help the poor, all right? You have the march of communism after World War II. Now, I wouldn't exactly call this the kind of communism that Marx was putting forward. Marx had imagined that there would be spontaneous communist revolutions happening in worker societies. That's not what Stalin communism was. Stalin communism was all power to me, Stalin, and I will determine what is good for you. That's hardly communism. We shouldn't even call it communism. To call Stalinism communism is an insult to communism. But in any event, there was this fear that after the tremendous poverty and destruction that had been caused by World War II, that if the government didn't step in, we could see severe consequences to our political system here. Desperate workers will resort to desperate measures if they see that the current status quo system is not working for them. So, this post-war settlement, known as the collectivist consensus, reflected a widespread agreement that the government should work to narrow the gap between rich and poor and seek to manipulate the economy in order to provide for more economic growth and even full employment. In other words, the Labor Party which represents the workers, trade unions, and the Conservative Party, which has always represented business and the elite, come to an agreement in which they say the government must step in to ameliorate the economic problems that a free market, laissez-faire economy creates. Now, of course, they can still argue over what kind of policy should be implemented. They still argue over how far the government should go in ameliorating these problems, but there was an agreement that the government needed to find ways to provide full employment. You know, we are still arguing about universal health care here. Great Britain settled that issue 100 years ago. The government should provide health care for everybody. The goal was to ease class tensions and to provide greater stability to the social and political system through three ways. First, price controls through production units and cartels, as well as trade protectionist policies of domestic industries. The government would actively step in to protect British industries, if necessary, by providing subsidies, that is money, to them. Also by creating trade barriers, tariffs, to prevent, say, American goods from coming in and overwhelming British-made goods. I mean, isn't it ironic? That's what the United States did back in the 1800s. We actually put tariffs on textiles that were being made in Great Britain because we wanted to give room for American textile companies in New England to grow. So we slapped tariffs on British-made clothes. Now the Brits are doing the same thing to the Americans after World War II in order to protect their own industries. Second, policies of taxation and interest rate control, as well as deficit spending that could manipulate the economy. This is very Keynesian, if you're familiar at all with John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes absolutely rejected the notion that we should just let the market float wherever we want. Because if you do that, you will inevitably have inequality. Instead, what you should have is an active government that uses monetary policy, that's what it's called, monetary policy, in order to try and nudge the economy in certain directions that will benefit, if not every single person, most people. And we can do that, for instance, through government-controlled interest rates. Interest rates are really important because they determine how much it costs you to borrow money. Now, why is that important? Maybe you want to buy a house. Maybe you want to expand your business. Maybe you want to send your kids to college. Maybe you just want to take a vacation. You know, even spending money on a vacation can boost the economy. How much money it costs you in interest is going to determine whether you expand your business, whether you buy that boat, whether you buy that new house in Palo Alto or San Jose, whether you send your kids to a 4-year Ivy League or community college. Monetary policy is really, really important. And it is a rejection of laissez-faire economics. Now, again, liberals and conservatives can disagree, and they do disagree over just how active the government should be in that kind of monetary policy. But there isn't much of a debate today, except really by kind of extremists on the right that say, we should go back to the gold standard. We should completely take the government out. All right, well, we tried that. It didn't work back in the 19th century. I don't understand why anyone would think it would work today in the 21st, when you actually have more complex problems than you did back in the 19th century. Third and finally, more emphasis on welfare initiatives such as healthcare, education, and an unemployment safety net. If we can create the conditions where people don't have to worry about falling not just through the cracks, but into a chasm, which is what it used to be, by giving them a pension, they are now going to be able to retire and not have to worry about working as long as they can until they get too sick or they just die. We can ensure that people have health care, which not only creates for a better workforce because it is a more healthy workforce, it also gives people more money in their pockets because they are not worried about spending it on healthcare. Now, there are arguments on the other side. Certainly you can say, well, money may not be coming out of the consumer's pockets, but it is coming out of the consumers who are having to pay higher taxes. Yes, that's absolutely true. Right? So there are costs absolutely associated with a larger welfare state. And we're going to talk about in a few moments here how those costs eventually become so huge that it leads to the government rolling them back. But after World War II, this collectivist consensus, there was a consensus on both the left and the right that the government needed to take a more interventionist role. So this post-war settlement remained in place as long as the economy stayed healthy. And after World War II, right after the war, things were terrible. Even Great Britain, of course, had been decimated. Huge swaths of London had been destroyed by the Blitz. Its entire economy was geared towards building war machines, right? Not consumer items. So it would take some time. Just as we had here in the United States, it would take some time after the war to transition to a peace-based economy. But eventually it did, and the economy boomed. So you could build this kind of welfare state because the economy was flush with money. But what happens when the economy starts to slow? Well, throughout the 1960s, Great Britain was becoming less competitive in the world market. It faced fierce competition, not just from the United States, which of course came out of the war stronger than any other nation on earth, but also from Japan and Germany. I mean, isn't that ironic? The two countries that you defeated now suddenly are beating your ass economically, and that's because those two countries were so decimated by the war that they essentially rebuilt their economic industrial base from scratch, using, of course, all the new technology. And they did it with the help of the United States, because the United States wanted to ensure that these two countries wouldn't go communist. So in order to ensure that, we need to pour in millions of dollars, billions of dollars, really. We need to ensure that they are integrated into our defense structure so that they can serve as beacons, as models of a capitalist nation in the post-World War II era. Budget deficits, trade deficits, and a severe recession in the 1970s, in which inflation rose to 20% and labor strikes gripped the country, brought the collective consensus crumbling down in 1979 with the election of one very, very important woman, known as the Iron Lady. Margaret Thatcher transformed British politics by employing an authoritarian populism. That's a fascinating term, an authoritarian populism, in her calls for an end to collectivism. Right? Authoritarian populism. This is, I think, a reference to the kind of what Judas in his article refers to as right-wing populism. Certainly Judas would agree that right-wing populism has an authoritarian bent. I mean, that's his argument. That's what we see, for instance, throughout Europe. The kind of right-wing populism really is just authoritarianism, rhetorically. So Margaret Thatcher is putting forward what is referred to as authoritarian populism. The welfare state and self-serving union, she said, were responsible for Britain's decline. And so she proceeded to dismiss both. She preached an enterprise culture consisting of tax cuts, reduced social services. There we go. Reduced social services and an active economic policy to stimulate competitiveness and efficiency in the private sector, all in the hopes of jumpstarting Britain's moribund economy. Her answer was to look to the free market for solutions rather than to the government. Now, if this sounds vaguely familiar to you, it may be because this sounds a lot like Reaganism. But you know what? We should actually be calling Reaganism Thatcherism, because it was Thatcher who came onto the political scene first with these free market ideas. I'm not suggesting that Ronald Reagan copied her, Certainly Ronald Reagan had been, excuse me? Ronald Reagan had, of course, been bringing these ideas to the forefront and going over in his mind for the previous decade. But it's not until 1979 that we actually see this free market, what came to be known as supply side economics here in the United States. Supply side economics was actually tried first in Great Britain. Now, again, if you are of the left persuasion, you may say, how on earth did these people ever embrace such a crazy strategy? You may think it's crazy if you're on the left. And the reason they came to embrace it, whether it's crazy or not, and I'm not going to make a judgment here myself as to whether it's crazy or not, but what I can tell you is that people embraced it because by the 1970s, they had come to the conclusion that the collective consensus that an interventionist state was not working. And we, of course, come to the same conclusion here in the United States. Remember, compare and contrast. You have to be comparing and contrasting the whole time when you're studying these countries. In the 1970s, here in the United States, the reason why Reagan is so popular in getting elected in 1980 is because you see an economic collapse. You see inflation heading up into the double digits here in the United States. You see strikes. You see high interest rates, right? Stagflation. That's what we call it here in the United States, when you actually have recession and inflation. Normally, you don't have these two things together. They are, in many ways, opposite. Inflation comes because an economy is growing too fast. Recession comes because an economy is slowing. So how can you possibly have both? What we see, therefore, is a global phenomenon. And a lot of countries, a lot of Western democracies, Germany is the same thing. Helmut Kohl also is a kind of Reagan free market conservative. He also wins election in the 1980s. But it all starts with her, with Margaret Thatcher. Now, critics argued that while her enterprise culture policies did indeed stimulate the economy, and there's no question that it did. I mean, facts are facts. People on the left can argue whatever they want, but facts are facts. The economy grew. That is for certain. We also see a taming of inflation. But here's where facts come under debate, come under interpretation. You know, Harry Truman, one of my favorite presidents, Harry Truman used to say that he wished that he could find a one-armed economist. Why a one-armed economist? Because every time you ask an economist a question, they say, well, Mr. President, on the one hand, you have this, but on the other hand, you have this. He wanted a one-armed economist. So what do we see with the facts? The economy was growing in Great Britain and in the United States, no question about it. But was it an even growth? It was not. Just as in the United States during the Reagan, and I should add the Clinton years. Let's not just blame it all on the Republicans. The Democrats also had this problem, less of an extreme in the 90s, but still a problem. Uneven wealth growth. The rich get incredibly rich, whereas the working class actually shrinks, right? We see fewer people at the end of the 1980s making the kind of wages in working class jobs that they did at the beginning of the decade. And that's largely because of economic trade policies in which a lot of those jobs simply vanished. Now, is that the fault of Reagan? Not necessarily. But is it the fault of an economic policy that said we are going to promote free trade? Well, yeah, in many ways it is. Is it something that can be stopped? Is globalization inevitable? I kind of think that it is. So I have to tell you, I'm sort of torn myself. Certainly, I don't want to see auto workers in Michigan lose their jobs. But I don't know how you can possibly keep them there as long as you have a globalized world market. And I don't see how you can actually do away with globalization, not unless you truly build a wall and completely isolate yourself. And we see how successful that is in a country like North Korea. Well, again, the critics said that during the 1970s, her economic policies enriched the wealthiest while squeezing the poor and the middle class. Moreover, they argued that these were short-term solutions. They didn't address long-term problems. You can say that, well, we're more competitive now here in Great Britain. Well, the reason why you're more competitive is because the inefficient factories that you used to have were closed. They didn't become more efficient. In fact, what those corporations decided to do was close those factories and send them to a country where they could make goods cheaper. So on paper, this corporation absolutely is making more money, which you can say, it's more efficient, but it's not more efficient because Brits have better jobs. Brits have lost those jobs. So these were short-term solutions. They weren't dealing with the long-term problems that continue to persist. Economic decline, a workforce that was not trained in the skills necessary to succeed in the 21st century's fast-paced new technology marketplace. And of course, increasing class and racial inequality. During the 1980s, Reagan used to say, hey, what are the unemployed complaining about? There are plenty of jobs. Just look in the classified section of the newspaper. And he was right. There were plenty of jobs at Taco Bell and Disneyland. I had a job at Disneyland when I was in college back at UCI. I worked at Disneyland. I could never support a family on it. It was a great college job. But the idea that you could support a family on it, not possible. So these are other factors that we have to take into consideration. Yes, we see the creation of more jobs because societies like Great Britain and the United States have moved away from a manufacturing economy to a service-based economy, where honestly, there are lots of jobs at places like Starbucks. But Starbucks is not going to give you the living wage that you had when you were working at General Motors. And so that's the problem. That's why we see an actual decline in the working class. We see more people entering the working poor than we do leaving the working poor. Because you can make the minimum wage working 40 hours a week and still be considered poor. Still be below the poverty average, especially in places like California for the federal minimum wage. They're referred to as the working poor. They aren't poor in the sense that they're living on the street or they're unemployed, but they are poor in the sense that every single paycheck from month to month goes into every expense that you've got. You're not saving anything. You're not putting anything away for retirement. And woe if you have a medical problem, because that'll wipe you out. You want to send your kid to college? You better hope that kid gets a scholarship. That's the working poor. And so we see bankers and doctors and lawyers and college professors and engineers who college professors marry, they do very well during these types of economies of economic growth. But the auto workers, the manufacturing base that you used to have in these two countries, that's gone. It's not gone, but it's irreparably harmed. So what does this mean? What this means is that while Thatcher was very popular among a swath of the population who benefited from her economic policies, there was still a growing discontent that the long-term problems of Great Britain were not being dealt with. In the short term, things were great, at least on paper. But in the long term, all of the problems that I just mentioned were still there. Well, though on the out since 1979, the Labour Party refashioned itself as New Labour with its young and charismatic new leader, Tony Blair, who promised a third way by offering an alternative to heavy state intervention and Thatcher. And if this may sound familiar to you, depending on your age and knowledge, it's because Labor is putting forward Bill Clinton's argument. Back in 1992, Bill Clinton was the new Democrat. Don't call me some liberal. I'm not a liberal. I love the death penalty. See, I'm even going to stop my campaigning so that I can go back to Arkansas and sign death warrants for all those who are about to be executed. I love the death penalty. I'm a conservative Democrat. I'm a new Democrat. And it worked for him. He won election in 1992. largely because you had a recession. But the economic argument that he put forward was not the old Ted Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Great Society argument that said we're going to spend our way out. Instead, it's we're going to build partnerships. Well, the Labor Party was no fool. It saw that the Democrats were able to refashion themselves and win elections. Why not try it here in Great Britain? Now, just like in the United States, there was a tremendous amount of discontent within the Labor Party because you have true radicals in the Labor Party still. Right? The Labor Party is certainly far more to the left today than it was back in the 1990s under Tony Blair. And that's largely because, well, for reasons that I will explain to you, the left wins that fight within the Labor Department. Just as you can see the left and the moderates in the Democratic Party today fighting over who is going to control the party. Unquestionably, Joe Biden is a moderate, but Joe Biden also recognizes that he can't probably win the election without the support of progressives. And so we see this tension within the Democratic Party today. We'll see who wins out. I think a lot of it will depend on, assuming if Joe Biden loses, I think the progressives will basically take over the party. If Joe Biden wins, you will probably see this tension continue, at least until he either dies in office because he's very old or decides not to run for re-election in 4 years because he's very old. And then you're going to see this fight all over again. The Labor Party had this fight back in the 1990s, and Tony Blair won it. We're going to take it to the center because we are damn tired of losing elections. If you stay on the left in Great Britain, you will lose. And we just saw that in the last election. Right? The Labor Party thought if we move to the left, everyone's going to vote for us. And they didn't. So the Labor Party has long had this battle within itself. And in the 1990s, Tony Blair won it by saying, we're going to put forward a third way. We're not going back to the heavy intervention of the collectivist consensus. And we know that the enterprise culture of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, who was the successor to Thatcher, we know that this enterprise culture isn't dealing with the long-term problems, and the growth that it has created is uneven and therefore unsustainable. We're going to put forward partnerships between government and business. We're going to put forward a welfare reform in which people who are on welfare are getting the skills through training that they need to get off welfare. I mean, some of it is just right out of the Clinton playbook. It's quite remarkable, the kind of influence that we see. Thatcherism influencing Reaganism. Clinton's third way helping to shape Labor's third way. We are linked in many ways, Great Britain and the United States. If Britain was to compete globally, it needed an educated and well-trained workforce. It had to be better prepared for the globalized marketplace. Low inflation and limits on public spending would also provide for a stable economy that would attract foreign investment. Right? Foreign investment, that's usually an idea put forward by free market people. This is clearly a departure in which the Labor Party is now saying, we want foreign investment to come in. We want German and Japanese and any other countries who has capital to invest here in Great Britain. Build a factory here, open your bank here. We'll keep inflation low. We already provide universal health care. So that's an expense you don't have to worry about. That keeps your benefit costs down. So Great Britain, under the new Labor policy, is being sold as a kind of neoliberal economic ideal, an Eden, where we don't have the harshness of the enterprise culture of Thatcher, but we don't have the nanny state of state intervention in the collectivist consensus. We are creating a neoliberal Eden here in Great Britain, one where we embrace the free market, but we also expect the free market to step up to its responsibilities by helping to train people, by helping to provide the necessary skills that will get them better jobs. Partnership, that was a word that Tony Blair used a lot. Partnership between business and government. And the phrase, because every British politician loves to have a phrase, the phrase that he used was called stakeholder society. Labor swept the country like a tidal wave in the 1997 election. And by tidal wave, I mean, I believe it was this year that it won more seats than any political party in history in Great Britain in Parliament. And not just in Parliament, it also won council seats. Now, I haven't yet talked about city councils in the unitary system. We'll get to that, but it was just a tidal wave. And it proceeded to implement its stakeholder society programs, going even further than conservatives in promoting a neoliberal approach to monetary policy. Again, that word, monetary policy. How can we use the philosophy of Keynesianism in order to nudge the economy in a way that will bring the results that we want? And one thing that Labor does, which is totally remarkable, because you would expect this from a free market party like the Conservative Party, but not even the Conservative Party dared to do this. The Labor Party gave the Bank of England the sole responsibility of setting interest rates. Now, that may not seem remarkable to you, because if you are familiar with our own economic system, it's the Federal Reserve Board here in the United States that sets interest rates and has done so for the last 100 years. But not so in Great Britain. Parliament always set the interest rates. So it's not until the late 1990s when you actually see this economic policy going into effect, an economic policy that we'd had since the 1920s, earlier than that, under Woodrow Wilson. So this
Previously, Parliament set it. Previously, Parliament set the interest rates before the Bank of England.
Yeah, Parliament had the right to set the interest.
Oh wow!
Just like Congress.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, just like Congress had
Yeah.
the right to set the interest rates, because economic policy would be considered a federal power. Thanks for the question. Now, welfare recipients were actively encouraged to seek work or to face reductions in coverage. Right? The thinking here is here's the thinking. And again, it's right out of the Clinton playbook. We know that there are people on welfare who need it because they don't have the skills or because they have children at home and they can't work. But we also know, and personally and factually, this is a very small segment, but it tends to be over-exaggerated. We also know that there are people on welfare who could work, right? Who shouldn't be on welfare. And so these policies from both Clinton and Blair say you have now a set limit of how much welfare recipients, how much you can receive in terms of welfare spending. But here's the difference. It's not just you get 2 years and then you get cut off. Within those 2 years, we're going to do everything we can to help train you, or we're going to provide childcare assistance for you so that you can go out and find a job. We're going to provide health care for you and your children so that you don't have to say, well, God, if I'm unemployed, I get health care through Medicaid. But if I take a job at Starbucks and they don't have health care, then my kids don't have health care. When you are faced with that situation, it's not surprising that you would choose to remain on welfare. Not because you're lazy, but because you want to make sure that your kids have health care, because kids need health care. Kids get sick a lot. So what this welfare reform seeks to do under the Blair administration is not have to put women in that kind of choice. Well, Labor poured money into improving national health care and education. Labor was also lucky, just as the Clintons were lucky during the 1990s, because you had a growing economy, and a growing economy means more tax money coming in. You don't even have to raise taxes. If the economy is growing, you are going to get more tax money Now, the problem is when you start to cut taxes, and you cut taxes so much that you are not making actually more money. What we see happening during the 1980s with Reagan, the reason why we see the deficit exploding is because he cut taxes, but he didn't cut spending. And so even when the economy started to grow, it wasn't bringing in enough tax revenue to cover the, for instance, increased defense spending. Reagan, for instance, actually spends more money on the military during the 1980s than any peacetime president in history. So you have to be willing to find, if you are serious about controlling deficit spending, you have to be willing to raise taxes somewhat, but you don't have to raise them too high if your economy continues to grow. And that's what happened with Clinton. All right, in 1993, Clinton raised taxes on the rich. He got a lot of flack for it. Indeed, he lost Congress in 1994 because of it. But you know what? When the economy started to grow, those relatively minor increases in taxes helped to create a flush government coffers. And so Clinton actually left office with the government having a budget surplus. Right? He was the last president to actually have a budget surplus because the government was taking more money in revenues than it was. So Tony Blair is lucky as well. What you find is a growing British economy is making a flush government that can then use that money either for tax cuts, which is what the Conservative Party would have done. Right? The argument would have been, we need to cut taxes in order to grow the economy. But the economy is already growing. Economy is already growing. And so if you're just going to cut taxes, you're not using that money, labor would say, productively in order to build up your infrastructure, in order to build up human capital. You want to make sure that you have a population that can compete in the globalized economy. You better get them trained. Because honestly, people who make clothes are not the ones that are going to be employed in Great Britain 20 years from now, because all of those clothes are going to be made in Bangladesh. You need to find jobs here in Great Britain that actually people can do and make a good salary at. Things that people in Bangladesh can't do. That's how you stay competitive. Same thing here in the United States. You need to always be retraining your workforce. And of course, the political parties are perennially arguing over whose responsibility is that? The government's or private individuals or private industry? And it's a fair argument to have. But the fact of the matter is that the American public is not being retrained. The globalized economy is inevitable. General Motors is going to make cars at a place where it is cheaper to do so. And you know why? Not just because they want profits, but because Americans demand cheaper cars. Yes, we would love to buy American. I would love to buy American. But in the end, I'm going to buy the most cheap, efficient car that I can. And chances are that car is not going to be made here in the United States. So that is what the globalized economy does. It is driven not by, the Illuminati who are sitting in their big chairs somewhere in Venice planning how they can screw the little man. It's run by our own consumer desires. We want cheap goods. And if that means that these clothes that I am wearing are going to be made somewhere in the Middle East rather than here in the United States, well, I would love to buy American-made clothes, but in the end, I don't really look at the tag to see where it's made. I look at the price to see how much it costs. So you have to keep your workforce constantly up to date, retrained, so that they are doing jobs that make them competitive. And again, the reason why I'm stressing this so much is because when we get to Germany, very soon, you're going to find that Germany has done this brilliantly. Germany has done this, where the United States and Great Britain are still arguing over, well, who should do it? Who's responsible for it? That argument is not happening in Germany. Germany is retraining its workforce, and they are prospering because of it. Well, boy, it would be nice to say, therefore, happy ending, labor had all of these wonderful successes. But of course, it never works that way. because no economic policy is going to bring about 100% benefits. As with Thatcher's program, New Labour had a mixed record of success. While the gap between rich and poor did decrease from 21% in the 1990s to 18% by 2006, 2007, Britain was still far behind some of its Western European neighbors in reducing poverty. So we can look at the statistics and say, well, see the success? They reduced poverty by 3%, but they were still not comparable to the reduction of poverty on the continent. Now, Blair managed to keep Labour in power for 2 more elections, but which is significant. I mean, that's quite an achievement. But even with its win in 2005, its loss of 100 seats from its majority showed that the public confidence in the Prime Minister was, well, to be generous, waning. This was largely because of his determination to fight alongside the United States in the Iraq War, an extremely, very unpopular conflict within Great Britain. The vast majority of Brits did not believe that Great Britain should be fighting in Iraq. So why did it? Well, Blair was convinced that if the United States is going to war in Iraq and we want to be a global player, we need to tether ourselves to the United States. But this was not a popular decision, even within his own party. By 2007, Blair resigned from Parliament so that his successor, Gordon Brown, would have time to rebuild the public trust before the 2010 election. Unfortunately for Brown, the 2008 world financial meltdown did little to win over public confidence. Was the Labour Party responsible for this meltdown? Of course not, but that doesn't matter. Any more than George Bush was responsible for the global meltdown when he was in office. What matters is who's there. And when times are good, you get the credit, whether you deserve it or not. When times are bad, you get the blame, whether you deserve it or not. And that's what happened with Labour. When 2008 happened, Labour was in power. And so people blamed them. As James Carville of the Clinton campaign in 1992 said, it's the economy, stupid. That's what matters. Well, Brown's New Labour Party was rewarded for its 13 years in power with a hung parliament in the 2010 election. A hung parliament simply means there is no majority. There is no majority party. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party did not have a majority of seats. You may be wondering, how is that possible if there are only 2 parties? Well, there are not only 2 parties. There are, in fact, a number of different parties within Great Britain. The Liberal Democrats, for instance. You have some Northern Ireland parties that are out there. These days, you have what's called a Scottish party. We'll talk about them later, because they're really why Labour no longer is able to win power. The Labour Party essentially split, and I'll talk about that later, because we're running short on time here. But hung parliament. So what happens? Well, the party to decide who would take power was left to the Liberal Democrats, a very small political party. The Liberal Democrats used to be a major party. Right? They used to have prime ministers. Not since the early 20th century has that happened. So the Liberal Democratic Party is one of those political parties that is a centrist party, and actually made sense when you had a Conservative Party on the right and a Labour Party on the left. The Liberal Democrats were the alternative. They were the centrist party. But what happens when a Labour Party is pulled to the center by Tony Blair? You no longer need a Liberal Democratic Party. And so over time, their seats shrank smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where they were no longer a viable political party that would ever win a majority. But never before had they been in a position that I'm aware of that they would actually be able to decide the winner. Now, the Liberal Democrats are more center-left than they are center-right. So it would make sense for them to align themselves with the Labour Party. They did not. they aligned themselves with the Conservative Party. And the Liberal Democratic Party was rewarded in the next election by losing almost all of its seats, because Liberal Democratic Party members were furious that the Liberal Democrats decided to side with the right rather than the left. So the Liberal Democratic Party today, I may have a chart here that shows how many seats they are, but it's an insignificant political party today. This was a huge political miscalculation on their part. Well, if Blair could refashion the Labour Party by putting forward a combination of Labour and Tory programs with the center-left tilt, Cameron would do the same, but with a center-right emphasis. David Cameron was the Tony Blair on the right. He was the new pretty face, the one who spoke eloquently, the one who talked about sacrifice and the importance of individual responsibility, but did it without all the harshness of a Margaret Thatcher. He called himself, in fact, a compassionate conservative. Does that sound familiar? It should, if you are familiar at all with the George W. Bush election, because back in 2000, that's exactly what George Bush called himself, a compassionate conservative. I tell you, these Brits, they steal everything from us. So this compassionate conservative attracted young people to the party, which itself is also remarkable because young people tend to be more liberal, they tend to be more idealistic, they tend to vote for something like the Labour Party. But a lot of young people were dissatisfied with the Labour Party, partly because of the Iraq War, partly because of the economic collapse in 2018. And so they hear this young, pretty-faced, compassionate conservative talking about the things that they are interested in. He promised, for instance, to address climate change. That's pretty remarkable that anyone on the conservative side would even recognize that climate change is a problem. He talked about the gap in wealth, both domestically and internationally. He preached civic involvement and volunteerism. My God, he sounds like a Tony Blair Labourite. So, again, I can't help but make comparisons here. George W. Bush, when he was running in 2000, understood that the old Reagan ideas would no longer win elections. If he wants to win elections, he has to move to the center, at least in his rhetoric. Bill Clinton taught him that in 1992 and 1996, when Clinton realized, if I run on the left, I lose. If I run in the center, I win. And so the compassionate conservative argument that came out of George Bush's campaign in 2000 was enough to win over, because remember, this was a very, very close election. He did not win the popular vote in 2000, but it was enough to win over enough votes in the Electoral College. David Cameron appears to have learned that same lesson. I am going to move to the center, at least in my rhetoric, so that I can win over enough Labour voters to win power. And it works. He called it the big society. And this is where we'll end. Let's take a look at the 5 pillars of his society, and then we'll finish up because I'm nearly out of time. Localism and devolution. Local communities should have more power, from starting up their own schools to electing their own police commissioners. That's a very federal idea. Let's disperse power rather than centralize it in London. Volunteerism. Government can't solve every problem, and so people need to take an active role in their communities. That's something even people on the left can embrace and understand. Yes, community involvement, community activism. Support financial or policy for co-ops and charities and social enterprises. That's right out of Bush's playbook. 4th, open and transparent government, in which the government needed to publish government data to give people the right to recall members of parliament. That was never implemented, by the way, but it made for a great campaign promise. Calls for greater voluntarism and local control were coupled with the need to cut government spending. Unfortunately for Cameron, the worldwide recession had ballooned the national debt to 11% of GDP. Drastic savings were required across all government departments except National Health Service, because the Brits love their health care. It would appear on the whole that the big society was more rhetoric than reality. Perhaps it had always been just a kind of cynical ploy to win an election. Some efforts were made to implement these goals, but Britain under Cameron remained a highly centralized society as it does today. In the awarding of government contracts, charities were often passed over by firms which promoted private enterprises, and even Cameron stopped using the term publicly after 2013. But voters didn't seem to mind, because I'll tell you why. I'm out of time, and I know some of you have another class to go to, so I don't want to keep you. But I'll tell you why voters didn't seem to mind when we come back on Thursday. Have a great week, guys. I'll see you all virtually then.